additional 2 billion pairs from domestic demand. And since the recession, it's clear that countries with emerging leather industries will start to look at new destinations. Globalization has stopped being Americanization. The BRIC countries, to which you have to add Indonesia, 200 and plus million people growing very fast, and possibly you have to put in the Gulf region extending over to the Maghreb as well. They'll become new focuses for growing consumption of huge importance. And when you start talking about the restructuring of the leather industry that I've already mentioned, think of another thing that we're talking about, which we call time zone manufacturing. And this roughly splits the world into 3 different zones. Expect to see more production in Africa and in Eastern Europe for sales in the EU. Expect to see more production here in Mexico, in Central America and other parts of Latin America to deal with what you might call the Americas, and start looking towards China dealing more with its domestic market, and India similarly, and Asian production for Asian markets, and localized production within the time zone for other parts of the world. And that has implications on new sourcing plans, new supply chains, and of course for countries like Mexico, potential for foreign direct investment. And allied to this time zone manufacturing, we see innovation starting to change. You might remember Clayton Christensen's fabulous book on the innovator's dilemma and all his talk about disruptive innovation. And it kind of moves against our standard trend that we ought to add more features and benefits to everything, but it moves the other way to saying, no, let's start thinking about making them simpler and allowing them to do one thing, maybe 2 things really well, rather than over-engineering them and making them ever more costly. Some people call this reverse innovation. But since we've been talking about the frugal consumer as being a new trend, maybe the other term that's being used of frugal innovation is a better definition. And most of this thinking of frugal innovation or reverse innovation is actually not coming from the traditional highly industrialized companies where we expect all that innovation to come. It's coming from the developing parts of the world, where we're seeing new ideas in automotive engineering, new ideas in waste management and drinking water for the masses. And as we heard in the opening talks this morning, innovation tends to be effective when you have one really clever new thing put together with half a dozen old things in a new configuration to deal with real and measured consumer needs. It's not just about being clever for its own sake. It's not just about doing something new and saying it's an innovation. It's about this very clever reconfiguration of technologies for new markets. And we're seeing that. We're seeing in the United States significant and important footwear brands saying we can do part of our operation back here closer to home. We can reconfigure the way that we put the elements of our footwear together and diminish our need for huge transportation costs to bring everything from Asia. And you can imagine not just product innovation, but supply chain innovation. And you think about logistics. Why should companies take hides from the United States and ship them to Asia, turn them into shoes, and ship them all the way back to the United States. That's not a sustainable way of doing business in the long term. And it will change. And we need to think, what is our role going to be within that change? And consolidation in the industry will definitely still continue. In general, we see fewer larger units in the tanning industry. We see more tanneries with mixed shareholding rather than pure family ownership. We see product complexities, investment risks related to new plant and machinery, environmental costs, the need to deal with these strong customers and suppliers. They militate against the strong family business. And we expect, therefore, to see many more joint ventures, more vertical integration, and more experimentation with business structure. And we think the boutique tannery and the boutique shoe factory will become much better defined. It has a role. We're seeing it in Europe. They can work, but they have to be very, very clever. And environmental issues in their largest sense will play a huge role for future concerns, costs, and development, particularly of tanneries. Pressures have moved from this getting round legislation to meeting actual consumer expectations, which are reflected through retailers and brands. And some things are becoming clear. The concept of tanneries utilising only 50% of its inputs and putting the remainder away as solid or liquid wastes cannot survive even in the medium term. We need reduction, we need reuse, and we need recycling. And we need some new concepts like cradle to cradle into this scenario. The industry needs to start measuring things too, and to be transparent about the improvements and changes that it's undertaking. And associated this, we're expecting to see much more activity in the bio-based concept of making leather. The idea of replacing difficult inorganic chemicals with enzymes and smarter materials look to have a lot of long-term potential to help with our waste. And we need to start looking at some old technologies and old methods and old ways of doing things in dealing with tannery waste. An awful lot of the technology that can extract chromium out of shoes, out of leather goods at the point of end of life do exist. We just haven't bothered to commercialize them. Landfill's been available and it's been cheap, and we haven't taken the time to look at how we can extract this chromium, not just from finished products, but from shavings and trimmings, and do something useful with that waste material, or leave it with the technical nutrients extracted only with the organic nutrients that are safe to put back to land and is properly a nutrient for the future survival of organic growth within the planet. So new economics and increasingly coming to work here. And a lot of this research, which you might call has been lost, in the way that a lot of wonderful natural fibres got lost when we rushed into all the synthetic fibres and the nylons and things that we made our shirts out at the middle of the 20th century. And some of these technologies, I think, are here in Mexico. Many you see as you travel down to Argentina. They need to be replicated and developed on a worldwide basis and properly commercialise us. We also anticipate that tanners and end users will start to work much more closely together, not just about fashion and the mode, but on the design implications related to the end of life of a product. 90% of the matters related to the end of life of a shoe are decided at the design stage. What materials you use, what construction you use, decides how that article can be disposed of. The designers will have to understand the technology of the components they use and all the materials that they're working with very much better. And the message here is of quality leather. Our recent research at University of Northampton, where I spend quite a bit of my time with